You can sit down. So good morning and good afternoon all of you. For people who are away, it's a different timing for them. And I apologize for the delay because our guest speaker for today's talk was stuck in traffic jam, which was not predicted earlier. So coming to today's topic, which is on digital sequence information, I am reading out whatever FAO site is given. It says that digital sequence information, or DSI, plays a fundamental role in environmental and biological research, contributing to understanding of the molecular basis of life and evolution, and of the ways in which genes can potentially be manipulated to provide new therapies and cures for diseases, new energy sources, and other new products. So it is not only touching one field, it is touching plant sciences, health sciences, and different sciences that you can think of which employ use of genomic resources. So the term DSI currently has no agreed definition. This is the reason I was not able to get a good definition for DSI. There are differences in terminology in scientific circles which reflect differences in the material referred to, which makes it difficult to harmonize terminology, and hence there is no definition. However, it is clear that DSI is a critical tool in the conservation and sustainable use of genetic resources for food and agriculture. Countries rely on access to and exchange of DSI to deal with vital issues such as human, animal, and plant health, also food security and the environment. So to speak on this topic, we are fortunate to have Professor Saurabh Raghuvanshi, who is professor in plant molecular biology in Delhi University in Delhi. His research interests include to understand complicated regulatory networks operative in higher organisms, especially plants. These networks can be visualized as multiple ways, but he is concentrating on various microRNA dependent networks and other networks which are playing regulatory role in plants. And his ultimate aim of his research is to develop a self-perpetuating database that would act as hub of information for researchers world over, and also enable research groups to actively share their findings through the databases. He is currently heading the IBDC project, which is a very ambitious project from Department of Biotechnology, India, where they are developing a Indian biological database which will have multiple kinds of information, including sequence and images, etc. So I now invite Professor Saurabh Raghuvanshi to enlighten us on DSI. Thank you.
Thank you, and my apologies for being late. Unprecedented traffic today. Nevertheless, let's start the discussion today. And as Dr. Dinesh rightfully pointed out, DSI is something that is kind of very, very basic to all of us involved in biological sciences, be it molecular biologist, be it physiologist, be it environmental biologist, and a whole lot of branches on biological sciences. The definition per se, that is something that we will discuss today, and that is definitely a point of discussion because we don't have a definition right now. And why we don't have, that's also a point to discuss, and that is one of the aspects that we'll discuss. Now, one of the things which I'm trying to concentrate here is that being a student of biology, you must be having a lot of interaction with molecular biologists and related branches. We know what a digital sequence information can lead into, but what kind of advantages do we have from that kind of a study? But what is more important for us right now to understand is that there is a debate at international level about DSI, and today I want to discuss with you why we are having that kind of a debate and why it is very, very important for us to be actively involved in that debate. So what will happen today is that we are going to cover certain aspects over here. So definitely, what is DSI over here? What is the definition? Why is it that a definition is not there? To a molecular biologist, it may appear to be a very simple thing. It's a digital sequence information. What is there to discuss over, right? But there is a debate, right? Then, why is DSI becoming a hot topic? So one of the things that we need to understand is that many of us may not even know that it's a hot topic, because at national level, at least in India, it's not being discussed to that extent as it is being in international forums. So that is something that every country needs to discuss and keep and make a mind of their own. How is it that DSI is going to be handled? Then, should we be as scientists concerned about it, or concerned about it in the sense that we are users of DSI? That's okay. But should we take part in that debate which is happening, and that uncertainty? Should we take part into that and try to make a consensus out of it? And then ultimately, where do we stand at national level, and what is the way forward? Where do we need to move ahead on this? Now, in order to understand this aspect of DSI, we'll come to definitions later. In order to understand that there is a debate, why there is a debate, another abbreviation we need to understand, that is ABS, that is access and benefit sharing. So now this is something that basically involves access to a particular data or a material or whatever, and whatever benefit comes out of it, how do we handle that? That is what it's meant by when we say ABS and things related to ABS, that is access and benefit sharing. And the discussion that is happening at global level is basically when we combine these two terms, that is ABS on DSI, that is access and benefit sharing on DSI. That is where the entire debate is, and the debate is so strong and it has so far-reaching implications that even access of the material and the data to the scientists will also become limiting if we don't actually understand the ramifications and we are not part of this decision-making process. So what are we going to do today? We are going to understand what is all confusion that is going about on ABS on DSI, and what is the basic reason, what are the underlying reasons why these things are coming up. So let's move ahead, and we need to go back a little bit in time. Let's take you back to 1992, when the world decided on the platform of United Nations that there is a strong need to conserve our biodiversity. Now, conserving biodiversity is a very, very relevant thing, because that is what our planet is actually. And why there is a need to conserve? Because as we evolve, as human societies evolve, we tend to exploit our biodiversity. If we don't have rules, or if we don't have regulations to use this biodiversity, ultimately we will end up losing a lot of it. And that's the ecological imbalance that is happening. So in 1992, United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity was formed. That is the Convention on Biological Diversity, known as CBD. Informally known as Biodiversity Convention, is a multilateral treaty opened for signature at the Earth Summit in Rio 1992. So this is something that all countries agreed to, that there is a need to conserve biodiversity and we should have rules and regulations to do that kind of a thing. And there are three basic objectives. The major objective is conservation of biodiversity. And conservation of biodiversity can only happen if we are able to ensure a sustainable use of this biodiversity in our developmental process. So here's a shift in thought process, that we do agree on one fact, that humans will evolve to use the biodiversity around them. So it's not that we can going to stop it, we need to regulate it, because that is essential to our survival. Now the biggest gear or the wheel over here is, which is regulating these two, that is conservation and the sustainable development, is the access and benefit sharing which would arise from these use of this genetic diversity. Now, why this is? Because this is an economic model. Funds which are, whatever are generated over here, need to be distributed in an equitable fashion across the globe, and that is the idea that this kind of approach will help countries to actually develop programs that can help in conservation of the biodiversity. That was the basic philosophy of CBD. That if we are able to regulate monetization of use of biodiversity, then those funds will be an incentive to actually make efforts for conservation of biodiversity. So this is the big wheel, this is the big gear wheel which is actually driving these two objectives over here. And over here, I want you to take note of this term, because this is where the confusion arises, this is where the debate arises, the definition of genetic resources. Okay. Now here's an interesting fact over here, that US somehow is not part of this treaty. Okay, so that's one major country which has not signed this CBD for conservation of biodiversity. So we'll not go into the reasons of this. Right now we are concerned about this term, that is access to genetic resources. Now going in these lines, as part of the CBD, Nagoya Protocol was formulated, and this protocol is basically to lay down rules and regulation and guidelines for different nations across the globe to figure out models, how they can make a sustainable model for sharing the benefits that comes out of using the biodiversity. So that's what it says. It's an international agreement which aims at sharing the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources in a fair and equitable manner. It entered into force in October 2014. So these are the timelines. In 1992, the CBD was formulated. Then the TRIPS agreement was formulated in 1995. In 2002, and voluntary guidelines of Bonn guidelines were formulated for equitable sharing of the benefits. And then another treaty in 2004, that is International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resource for Food and Agriculture. So let us try to define biodiversity. What do we understand technically what it means? So for practical purposes, you can define, there's one human biology, then there is another agriculture. So agriculture, human biology and human related data is not part of CBD. That's number one. Number two, for regulation of agricultural resources and their benefit, this is the treaty actually. International Treaty on Plant Genetic for Sustainable Food and Agriculture. For rest of the things, be it plant, animals or microorganisms, the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol comes into picture. That is the practical overview of things, right? So ultimately in 2010 it was started, and then in 2014 it came into existence and it was enforced. India definitely is a signatory of this Nagoya Protocol for benefit sharing. Why it was important? Because it establishes more predictable conditions for access of genetic resources, right? So the point is that when you start an entrepreneurship, imagine, try to figure out that, try to understand that right now you are a scientist, that's fine, or you are a budding scientist, but somewhere down the line you want to become an entrepreneur, right? So you would like to have a very clear-cut idea, how can I make plant-based or other microbial organism-based products in a very clear-cut manner before you start investment of your time and investment of your funds and someone else's fund, because that is what an entrepreneurship is, because you can't work everything with your own funds, you hardly do that, you take it from your funders. So you need to be very sure whether you can actually commercialize this product or not. So that certainty needs to be there whenever you are trying to make any product related to biodiversity, or for that matter any other product also. So predictable conditions basically means that there's a clear-cut idea that okay, these are the things that need to be done, and then you can have a commercialization of the product, and this percent of your profit would be shared or whatever be the conditions. And then helping to ensure benefit sharing when genetic resources leave a contracted party providing the genetic resources. That is giving the benefit back to the parties when this is kind of a semi-scientific legal vocabulary over here. When you say party, so parties basically mean a group of people. Parties could be a nation, parties could be a company, or parties could be anything actually. But it is a group of people having one thought process. That's a party representing one. So it could be an institute also. So that's what it means. So Nagoya Protocol was formulated and things are fine so far. And these are the premise, or these are the things that are covered in the Nagoya Protocol. And has one interesting thing where there's genetic material over here. Then you have benefits arising out of this genetic material. What is also part of the Nagoya Protocol is the traditional knowledge which is attached to that biodiversity. Now here what it means is, if you take national perspective, that is in terms of India, that basically means if you talk about Ayurvedic formulations, this is a convention that is saying that there is a rule and regulation for making a product from directly accessing a biological material, plus there is also a benefit sharing on the knowledge which you take. That is, for example, any Ayurvedic formulation that you take, that knowledge also is under the benefit and sharing, because this is being treated as biodiversity, and the associated knowledge did not just happen. There were hundreds or probably in India thousands of years of knowledge that was culminated into these formulating these Ayurvedic and other alternate medicine formulations. So that's a traditional knowledge, and when anybody exploits that, how does the person know that Boswellia or any other plant, neem, is of importance? Because there was lot of studies, maybe not in a canonical fashion as we publish it today, but that information was there actually, right? So that's a traditional knowledge, and if you are making use of that knowledge, there has to be a benefit sharing. Okay, so that's the entire thing. Now why this is important to understand, that now we are talking about benefit sharing not just for the material, but for the information also, for the knowledge also. Okay, so keep that in mind when that's how we enter into this debate. So look at the cycle over here. There is a set of users and there is a set of providers. Providers are the people who would provide the genetic diversity, any plant. It could be a country, it could be a state, it could be a union territory, it could be a tribal region, it could be anything actually, right? That depends on what level you are talking about. So that's the providers. Now providers have access to the genetic material. Providers have access to this traditional knowledge also. So these are the two things. Then on the other hand, you have users. So people who are trying to make products out of it, who are trying to commercialize it, are the users. Okay. You can be provider, you can be user also, but whatever be the case. Now in this association, whenever there is a utilization, the sharing of the benefit has to go back on this to the providers. Now here again I introduce two terms and we will discuss these later also. I will just point them out. This is prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms. Okay. So when anything flows from the provider to the user, there has to be a prior informed consent. You need to tell the person that I'm going to do this kind of a thing. That's a prior informed consent. And then you must have a set of rules to how the benefit would be shared actually. That is MAT, mutually agreeable terms. Now this is fine, and now let us start to move slowly into where DSI is coming into picture. Okay, so this slide explains this transition from genetic resources. Why did we move into DSI? Now this is what it is. If you look at the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, the definition of genetic resources stands like this. Genetic resources mean genetic material of actual or potential value. And what is a genetic material? Means any material of plant, animal, microbial or other origin containing functional units of heredity. So that basically means any physical tissue, right, is under CBD. Now the extension that is happening is that when you talk about a physical entity, when you talk about plant tissue, you are talking about the plant tissue in entirety, right? So that genetic material, anything that is within that plant tissue is subject to this these rules and regulations. So DNA also comes into that, your proteins also come into that, your RNA also comes into that, your metabolites also come into that, right? But that's not the end of the story. The story starts from here, because what is contained in that information, in that tissue, is also an information, and that is where the debate lies. So what it says is whether the definition of genetic resource in the CBD covers DSI or not, that is digital sequence information or not. Now, just to make you aware of the restrictions of CBD, the CBD basically says that if you can't take any tissue, take it in your pocket and take a flight and go to US. That's illegal. You can't do that. Okay. That means movement of any live material across political boundaries is an illegal activity. You will have to take prior permission, and there are rules and regulations of every country. We will come to that. Now the point is, if this is what CBD says and Nagoya Protocol says, and if you make DSI part of this, then that basically means that you can't share DNA sequence also. Okay? So just keep these two things in your thoughts. These two questions, whether definition of genetic resources should cover DSI, and whether DSI should fall under the access and benefit sharing protocols. Okay, so why they are asking this question is because technically access and benefit sharing phenomena was applied to live tissues, not to the information, not to the sequencing, right? So this is the debate. Now, this definition has been used by groups, different groups across the globe. Now, these groups involve scientists, NGOs, legal entities, administrative organizations, whole lot of paraphernalia which is there at national and international level. Everybody is debating, and the point of debate is some of them are interpreting that DSI is an integral part of the genetic resource, some of them saying it is not, and that is where the debate is happening, and it's a live debate. You are there in a time period where nothing has been decided. The discussion is live. You can contribute to it actually. Okay. So let's try to understand that discussion. So slowly you see that the thought process is moving from tissue to the knowledge that tissue may provide. Okay. Now, here's a statement, here's a thought. Whether information is a resource derivative. What it means? Information, DNA sequence, resource derivative. That basically means that resource derivative, you take a tissue and you derive something out of it. For example, you make an extract. You take a tissue, grind it, and you make an extract, and you say this is a herbal remedy. So that's a derivative. Okay, that's a physical derivative. Whether this information also can be treated as a derivative. Now that is the debate, and people are pro and against it. Whether information becomes, and this is true, this issue is much broader and applies wherever, this is a very important statement, wherever the physical material is substitutable by information. When there is sufficient knowledge about the physical material, that further knowledge derived from the tissue is not needed. So try to understand, earlier CBD was made in days in 1992 when human genome was not even sequenced. It was getting sequenced. It started rather around that time only, and it took a decade to get sequenced. At that point of time, it was unimaginable to think that you would have so many DNA sequences, and we'll see that phenomena also. That is why CBD always traditionally, in our understanding as students and as scientists and as PI and whatever you can think of, was that CBD is dealing with live material, not with the information. And this has a major repercussion because in general schemes where information is a resource derivative that is part of the transaction, will directly conflict with the open domain. We'll discuss this point. Now, the point is, why are we stretching our imagination? Why are we stretching this fact that information can also be integral part of that resource, or genetic resource includes that DSI as its integral component and not a separate thing? Why are we stretching this definition? And there are equal number of people at both ends. Some of them saying yes, it should be, some of them saying not. So what is the reason why it is happening that way? And this is why it is happening. It's a simple cartoon that I prepared over here. What is happening is that this is the biodiversity, and I have intentionally put both a material as well as the users, because this is the live material, but live material is useless if you don't have the information which is there in the traditional, our ancestors, us. This is us also, not just some far-fetched tribe or something. We are all part of this. So this is information as well as the material. As per CBD, if this thing is getting exploited for money, there is an access and benefit sharing going back. Now, why this is happening? Why do they need the money over here? And this thing is very, very simple. This is how the societies and science evolve. People who can exploit, now exploit I'm not saying in a bad sense, okay? Exploitation is making use. People who can use and make use from a particular biodiversity are different than the people who are actually having that traditional knowledge. Fact of life. But if I'm using your knowledge, you figured out in your ancestral knowledge or whatever for 1,000 years, you had this knowledge that this plant gave out a particular medicine. It was good if you had fever or whatever things you can imagine. And I use that information to make a product. I must give you some of this, because how did I know that neem is important? There are thousands of plant species which are there. Can you imagine how people would have figured out that neem is the one that is good for its reasons? That's not a small task. We can say, okay, ये तो हमको बहुत पहले से पता था. We knew that for a very long time. But imagine I give you Earth with all its million species and then try to figure out which one of them is important for you and which of them is not. I mean, people must have tried different germplasms and different species. Some of them may have even died because there are deadly plants also. How did people figure that? So that's a very, very, very knowledge, very intense knowledge that has come out of over hundreds and thousands of years. Now, what is this open access thing doing? Now, this is what is happening. If you sequence this thing and put the data in open access, this data can be used to do any metabolic engineering. Right? You can do that, you know that. You can have the entire metabolic pathway engineered, and you will have the same active compound which you were extracting from here. So, why should I give the money to over here where I can openly access this data? Now, it is something like, just go back a little bit in your times when you must have given some examination. You must have had your answer where this competitive examination. Okay. So you imagine you had your MCQ, I don't know whether you people must have done that, where you circle the MCQ options, right? So you would like to keep that secure, because if your fellow companion sees that, then 1 mark difference in the mark sheet is going to make a lot of difference. So you will keep that thing secure. Even the invigilator will keep that sheet secure. But what if I say your sheet is secure, but all the answers you can see from here? I am not giving you my sheet, you can see the answer from here. That is taking the data open access. Now that person will do the same thing if he has trust on you that you have done everything correct, right? That's an information leak, that's an open access thing. Now you can keep your mark sheet with you in 100 vaults, but that information and the answers have leaked. This is what has leaked over here. So it is not an kind of an undue thought or undue discussion that there has to be some thought process regarding the benefit sharing which is coming from here. And this is a change in perspective. Why there is a change in perspective? This explains that. Now imagine 1992 and years 2000 to 2004, 5 and 6 up to 14, where human genome and Arabidopsis genomes and rice genome, they were sequenced. Those genomes took decades to sequence, right? And because of the technological advancement at that point of time, it took decades and huge amount of funds to even sequence one representative of one species, let alone the entire germplasm. That was an unthought of thing. From that point of time to currently, you are actually sequencing everything. So this sequencing and generation of data on biological materials has extrapolated to magnitudes, where you are not just generating data from model organisms, you are generating data of the entire biodiversity, and that is what this EBP is, Earth Biogenome Project, which targets to sequence all families and all different species and genera existing on Earth, all plants and animals. It's a big consortium of labs, and they are doing it. You can see now 1,000 genome, 10,000 genome projects are coming up, right? So basically what it means is that earlier when the biodiversity was untouched, you can access it only by uprooting or cutting a tissue from the plant. Now you don't need to do that. You don't need to go to any tribal area or any other place. You can just access its genome from NCBI and make a product out of it by metabolic engineering and have a nice startup. And nothing of the benefit sharing you are obliged to do. So this is where the contradiction is coming up, because our data generating capacities have changed and we are not restricted to model systems. We are sequencing and we are characterizing every organism on the face of Earth. Now when you do that, in these projects there is no provision for any sharing of ABS, that is access benefit sharing. That is not part of any of these projects. So what is happening, that data is getting generated, it is getting into open access, and people who have this information are feeling that their treasure is actually getting looted, because now you won't get any benefits back to you, even if the company or any other entrepreneur utilizes your knowledge, because you have put it in open media. This is the crux over here. Now where does India stand? Now India is a hotspot of biodiversity. There are 3 hotspots of biodiversity. Himalayan regions, Western Ghats and Indo-Burma. You can see over here these red regions and on the top. Right? So India is not just rich in biodiversity, it is rich in the knowledge on that biodiversity. So it is not just that you have so many different herbs and things like that. It is the knowledge that which of these herbs and how do you want to use it. That also is there in our traditional knowledge. Okay, so that is one aspect very important for India. So people realized that within CBD there has to be a discussion, because CBD was all about conserving the biodiversity, and when the people realized that all the biodiversity is getting characterized, we would be left with actually nothing. There would be no benefit sharing, because the data that is coming out from that biodiversity is open access. So you can keep your plant to yourself. I don't need that. I just need the sequence, and which is there in the open access. So nobody is going to access that. Okay. So the thought process in the CBD that started to change, and first mention of DSI was in Conference of Parties to CBD. Now, Conference of Parties, again, COP, you must have heard that there's a COP COP27 meeting in Egypt, and where PM had also gone. That's a different COP. That's Conference of Parties on Environmental Issues. This is COP on CBD. Okay, so don't get confused because the numberings are different. That is COP27. This is on COP14 or something, which is 17, I think, which is slated to be organized in next month in Montreal. So the term first was introduced in 2016, and this DSI term, wherever it was introduced, probably was not done in a very intelligent fashion, because it's a very ambiguous term, and we'll see why it is. Discussions kept on happening in 2018. The COP on CBD agreed that there is a point of discussion. The different parties have different views. So that is the first step to address any problem, is to first recognize that there is a problem. So this happened in 2018, when in this decision of CBD, it noted the divergence of views of parties on this matter and decided to establish a science and policy based process, which included the convening of ad hoc technical expert group. Now this is the meeting, this is the group that is actually discussing and making trying to make recommendations on how DSI has to be handled. Now these are the interesting facts. As I said earlier, the term DSI does not have an internationally agreed meaning, and it is actually a placeholder. Placeholder in the sense that people realize that you can talk about DSI in several terms, but it was already there in their discussion and as a written phenomena. So DSI continues till date, but its definition is again first point of debate, that what is the definition of DSI, and this concept is not clear. So let's see what is the concept. Now, to a molecular biologist, at least to me, the first time I heard digital sequence information, I took it for granted it's talking about DNA sequence, right? But when you look into the discussions, when the lawyer starts to interpret it, they are going to the extent that even sequence of the molecule in a compound molecule is also a sequence. You can't deny that actually. As a scientist, you can get a little frustrated on the fact that what is this? DNA sequence, digital sequence information has to be DNA, but that's not the fact. So these are the three options. Again, it's not a definition. These are three options. First is it includes DNA and RNA. Then DNA, RNA, proteins and epigenetic modifications, and then metabolite and macromolecules also. Now this is why group 3 is coming into picture, because sequence information, a sequence could be anything. A sequence could be of nucleotides, sequence could be of amino acids, sequence could be of carbon atoms, sequence could be of anything. And it is very, very difficult to defend our impression of DSI as a DNA sequence information. It is a digital sequence information. So everything comes into picture, and then this associated knowledge about it. And the repercussions of adopting any of these definitions is going to be very, very different. Okay? Because when you have to commercialize, you have to make a product. This is where you are looking at. Because the concept, the discussion is not happening in a fashion in which science has to be conducted. It is happening in the fashion in which benefits to the common person are protected. So people are trying to understand and trying to use their imagination in defining DSI, that if it is a digital sequence information, and that fact is always there in the back of the mind, that if I just stop it at DNA and RNA, I can never have any meaningful access and benefit sharing, because people will just, fine, you keep your RNA and DNA sequence to yourself, this is open, I will work on protein. Metabolic pathways would be there still. If you stop over here, fine. I can engineer get the same metabolite from any other place. So the idea is how to ensure access and benefit sharing. Right? That is the driving force. You may call it unscientific or non-scientific, but it's a fact. Okay. So that's a great debate. And the great debate is, what should the scientists do? Scientists are kind of caught between two things. At one point they know that if we maintain the open access to the DSI, that is the hallmark of research. Imagine if NCBI and GenBank were proprietary. Nothing would have happened. The impact of human genome sequencing or human genome was only realized because the entire sequence was made public. There was no restriction to its access. That is how science moves. And this is a very fundamental, it's a hallmark. And the hallmark of big data analytics. When you talk about big data analytics, you will realize that there is not a single group or even a single institute which can completely exploit all its knowledge. Everybody would be looking at the same big data or the same NGS sequences or microarray or whatever you call them with a certain perspective. You go to a different institute, they will look at it from a different perspective. So in order to ensure that the big data is utilized to its maximum, the first thing that needs to be done is to make it available to everyone. I would look at point A, you would look at point C, you will look at point D and E and F, and there are 100 perspectives from which you can actually look at data, and that is what has happened with the human genome data. So if you stop access to that, how is science going to happen? Then we all become businessmen actually. I have to not just write a grant, I have to figure out how to get access to that money, to get access to that biodiversity thing. Right? On the other end, whatever we are exploiting or understanding right now is based on the knowledge that has been generated over hundreds and thousands of years. We can't take that as granted. So somewhere, and you will see that it is not the discussion between different parties within a country, it's a discussion between different countries. I will see that point. Now, what is clear cut is the status quo is not acceptable. Meaning thereby that whatever understanding we have right now, that CBD is only live material and rest is open access, that cannot stay. We'll have to figure it out. Right? Now, these are the eye openers actually. And this is the answer to the question that should scientists be concerned. So yes, many sequence using scientists are unfamiliar with the international politics that is going around this DSI thing. Right? Many of us, I would say 80% of us are oblivious to this fact. But if we don't take care, all our research is going to get locked because of this irreversible decisions. If an irreversible decision is taken, then scientists can't do anything actually. Right? That is why, and the scientific community is the primary user of DSI. Even companies will go via scientists. Right? Scientists can be anywhere in the institute or in a company, but the scientific fraternity which is the primary user of the DSI. So how is it that they are not getting completely represented in those discussions? And I'm talking about molecular biologists, I'm talking about physiologists, I'm talking about everyone actually over here. So, the writing on the wall is very, very clear. And it's a loaded statement. A heavy statement for me actually, who have done almost all our sciences in open access mode. Right? For us it is very, very unimaginable to think that I'll have to pay something to get anything from NCBI. Nevertheless, what is writing over here? More scientists need to engage in the search for practical, evidence-based. This is very, very important. It should not be a knee jerk or a statement or a philosophy that is totally by a legal entity. It has to be an evidence based thing. And the biggest, heaviest term is compromise. Evidence based compromise in order to avoid worst case outcomes. So while going through, and for last couple of years, while going through all of these discussions and everything, what has come to the mind is status quo can't be there, that we can keep on having an open access phenomena and we cannot keep on ignoring any access benefit sharing. So there has to be a compromise, but it has to be an intelligent compromise, so that there is a benefit sharing also, but the science is also not inhibited. Now, how to do that? Now this is where the discussion is now coming up. There have been dozens and dozens of discussion groups which personally I have been involved in, mostly trying to listen and trying to figure out why everybody is after this. It boils down to certain points, and this is what it is. There are several models. Don't get intimidated by so many things. We'll take it one by one. Okay. There are certain models which are being proposed. Status quo not acceptable, then we have model number 1, model number 2, these different variations of second model, different variation of third model, and fourth and fifth. So there are total about 5 different models that are circulating across the world, and people are trying to figure out which one is better. This is what we need to understand actually. Two another terms which I said earlier also, you need to understand if you want to understand these models. One is PIC, another is MAT. Prior informed consent and mutually agreeable terms. Prior informed consent basically means, as the English is very clear, I need to first ask you or first tell you. Every time I have to ask you. Mutually agreed terms basically means that once it has been decided that this is the way, I don't need to come every time and ask you. Once you have told this is where the treasure is, go pick 2 coins and come back. You can't pick more than 2 or whatever you think, figure out. That is the mutually agreeable term. What is the difference? In PIC, every time I have to go and ask you. In MAT, I don't have to do that. Before launching a company as an entrepreneur, I know what needs to be done. These are the list of things, maybe 100 things or whatever, but I know that this is what needs to be done and I will do it. Now, all models differ in this. The first model is that it assumes that genomic resources or genetic resources, not genomic resources, cut that out. This is a knee-jerk again definition. Genetic resources. Genetic resources is equivalent to DSI. Means whatever was thought about or restrictions were put for genetic resources, all of them are ported onto the DSI. That is the first model. It's a bilateral mechanism. Both PIC and MAT present. PIC and MAT are integral part of Nagoya Protocol. In Nagoya Protocol, bilateral basically means there are 2 parties. And here the party is not me and you. Here the party is USA and India, USA and Europe, USA and UK. Okay? Countries are parties here. So if somebody in US has to use anything from India, they have to take a prior informed consent, and I'll tell you from where, and then they can use it. And then there is MAT also. So there is a bilateral mechanism. Now what happens in bilateral mechanism? If suppose in India you want to be an entrepreneur and you want to use something which is there in USA, it goes in USA. So you will have to make a bilateral agreement with USA. Then you figure out there is a one very good herb in Thailand. So for Thailand also you will have to make one. Then Singapore, then Pakistan, Nepal, Australia, whatever. These are all different bilateral mechanisms. For each one of them you will have to do the paperwork. Multilateral basically means that everybody agreed to this one multilateral terms. So that saves time. Access is regulated similarly to the genetic resources under the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. Access basically means you can't touch that plant. You can't pick it up and take it. So you can't take up the DNA sequence and just use it. First you will have to take a consent, and then you will have to whatever the terms be. Researchers have to comply with national ABS requirement. Now, Nagoya Protocol is always at national level. Every nation defines their own agreeable terms. Okay. Trace each DSI back to the country of origin. Now, this is not a small thing. I'll show you what the problem is. Tracing where this sequence came from. Okay, that also needs to be done, and then negotiate with multiple and different ABS requirements for each country. Okay, so that is model 1, full-fledged ABS. Now let's try to make some concessions, and that is where we go into option 2, that is standard MAT. Here we have a standard mutually agreeable terms. Access to DSI is not restricted, but obligation to share benefit. That is, I can access the DNA sequence, but if I make it commercial, then I am obliged to give you back. So at first instance, DNA sequence you can take, but if you commercialize it, then you will have to pay. This thing, obligation to share benefit, can be triggered by determined standard milestones while product development. Milestones in the sense that that maybe you figured out that okay, this is the product, this is the metabolite, now I'm doing a pilot test. So the moment you come to a pilot test, that's a trigger. Okay, now you should start to give back. Or when you go to a production mode, or when you go to a commercialization. So these are what is meant by triggers. Okay, and then these can be implemented in sub option 2.1 and 2.2. That's a different. One of them is at national level, another of them is at international level. There is no need for individual negotiation of contract for each DSI utilization, and requires downstream monitoring of DSI. The problem with this thing is that somewhere somebody has to constantly keep on monitoring that okay, that person is using this information and now they are trying to commercialize it. So to implement, okay, now somebody needs to tell them, otherwise nobody will give any benefits. So that can be done by taking in your team or collaboration with journals, patent office, because whenever you develop any product of your own, the first thing you would like to do as an entrepreneur is to fix its domain, that nobody else develops that. Because if you don't do that, developing a product like you did, some other one also will do, and your market will just go down. So you'll have to protect it, and for that protection you go to the patents office. So whenever you go to the patent office, they will do a search, and if you had used a DSI, which you will have to actually declare over here, because otherwise you won't get a patent, then that's the trigger for you. That is how the surveillance can go. Now, third option is ABS obligation but no PICN. Means no prior informed consent, no mutually agreeable term. You will still have to share the benefits, and the way this is done is that payment or contribution goes to a multilateral fund. Now in this scenario, if you are not doing any PIC or MAT, it avoids tracing the origin of the DSI. It's not a one-to-one DSI, so you don't need to do that kind of a thing. Monitor the downstream utilization of the product. You don't have to monitor any product when it goes to monetization. There are various forms, and these are two. Payment for access to DSI. Suppose what this means is that you can have a database of DSIs, and whenever you access it, you will have to give some money. So that basically means that even if you use it or you don't use it, you will have to give the money, certain upfront fees, and then whatever you do with it, that's a different thing. So there is no tracing of the DSI, who is using what, when that trigger will happen. Whosoever has accessed will give some token amount of money, and that can be decided either at national level or at international level. There are other modes of payment also. One is that access is payable, and there is access is not payable, but there are certain kind of a taxation scheme. Okay, micro levy on associated product. Now this is a very I don't know how to. It's a suggested thing, but which to figure out which equipment is used to generate a DSI, actually I can't figure out an equipment which is not used to generate a DSI. Every equipment, it could be a centrifuge, it could be a MALDI, it could be a dextrocrystallography, whatever. It's an information. So I don't know. That basically means that levy on all scientific instruments. So that basically what it is trying to say over here is that whenever you enter into this kind of a project of generating knowledge, you give taxation right over there. It goes into some central fund, be a national or be international as per whatever be the thing, and then from there the benefits are shared. Okay, so you don't have to think a lot on this. How to implement this? That's one aspect. Okay, the fourth option is DSI access is not regulated. There is no PSI, PIC or MAT, multilateral mechanism, and no tracing required. This is something that happens these days also. That the benefit can be given in form of grants. For example, any country can give India particular under a model grants in exchange of using a DSI over here. So they can figure out at national level, international, they can figure out ki this amount of fund has to come because this amount of DSI is being used from India and whatever, a complicated thing, but still it's a thing workable. So what is happening is that here develop, now this is a divide in the thought process of the develop and developing. As I said, this is a fight between two countries. So this is what is happening. So developed nations are saying that, ironically, I don't know how, most of the biodiversity is in countries which are developing or underdeveloped, and most of the developed countries are looking at biodiversity in these countries, right? So there is the biodiversity users and then the biodiversity providers. Okay, developed versus developing countries. Now it is something like you wrote a novel and you made a pact with the publisher, okay, give me upfront something and then I don't care how many copies you sell. The second option is, if you really think your book is very good, it's going to be a bestseller and it's going to sell for the next decade, you would not make that agreement actually. You will say, no, give me the share of every transaction that you make. So that is all economics that is going over here. Developed between developing nations, because developing nations are saying that there is a lot that can be done and one-time fees cannot actually decide that kind of a thing. It has to be one-to-one. That's where the discussion is coming. And the fifth model is opposite of the first model, where there is no benefit sharing. Doesn't matter. Whatever benefit, nobody is going to pay anything. Just take the data, use it, it's your money. Okay? So these are the 5 models. Now coming back to this model. These are the 5 models, and take a look at this first blue line over here. This is one dimension in which, these are the different dimensions in which you should look at these models. That's why it is important. In this one, access to the DSI is regulated. Here, access is not regulated, benefit sharing is being enforced. Access is free, you can take it, but somewhere you have to figure out the benefit sharing. Prior informed consent is needed only in this one, not in any of these models. Mutual agreeable terms is only in these two and not in all of these. So basically these are telling that if you take this model, these are the dimensions that you need to worry about. Over here you can say that this is linked benefit sharing linked to DSI data. That is per se the data is, whatever data is generated, that is linked to the benefit sharing. Here it is not directly linked to the data, because you are giving a levy of whatever the data was, whatever the sequence, it doesn't matter. Once you have to do it's a kind of a common portal for doing these transactions. This is an important practical aspect actually, which is requiring tracing of the origin. Because how will you figure out which country to give benefit if you can't trace where that sequence is coming? Now you may wonder that how can you not know from which country that sequence is coming? So here the difference is, it doesn't matter whether who has submitted. That's not the country of origin. The country of origin is country of origin of the tissue. So if I take something from Bangladesh and research it in India, the country of origin is not India, it's Bangladesh. So in my affiliation, I will write a research institute in India. So that's not the thing. Okay. Now, and the last one is bilateral versus multilateral mechanisms. In general, bilateral mechanisms means that with every country, every group, you will have to do a agreement. Multilateral is something that is less complicated. It is complicated in the beginning. A thought process is very complicated, but once established, once agreed upon, then the afterwards implementation is very smooth. And these things, they sound simple, but these are the things that will have the impact, a very major impact on how country progresses, how the science of the country progresses. If you make it too tight, no product is going to develop. And if you make it very, products will get developed, you won't get anything. So, this is the distribution of countries which are generating nucleotide sequence data, and you can see that India is on 5th position over here. What is interesting over here, that only 16% of the entries in GenBank have countries of origin. The rest, nobody has put that data because this was never thought of. It was not made a mandatory field. Now the point is, for the existing data, how is benefit sharing going to be implemented? Who is going to do that? GenBank can't do that. That researcher may have moved on to the next crop, email may have become invalid or whatever. There's no way you can actually, for million of sequences, you can go back and get this information. So that's one thing. Another interesting aspect is that while India is 5th in producing the data, it is 3rd in using the data. So we are using a lot of data, but we are not generating a lot of data. Okay, and that is one very big problem which I'll address later on. So now let's take a look at the national perspective. So along with 1992 CBD and later on, the Central Biological Diversity Act in 2002 was formulated in India. This is the website over here. The Act does not have any mention of DSI per se. DSI is not even mentioned over there. The remote, if you can stretch your imagination, is this Article 4 of the Act, where results of a research are mentioned. So what it says, that obtained from India for monetary consideration or otherwise to any person who is not a citizen or who is a non-resident of income tax. So what it basically means is, I'm not getting the full statement here, and this somehow is too small. What it means is that if you are doing any research and you can't transfer that information to a non-Indian entity, here's the clause: if the transfer means that it's a research publication or a conference proceeding, that is okay. So that's the saving grace here. Otherwise, no research publication gets published. Okay? So this is the thing about Biodiversity Act in India. What have they done now? Since this discussion came up in 2020, they have formulated this constitution of Expert Committee on Digital Sequence Information to figure out. This is the committee, and it's important. I'm giving this slide because you need to know the name of the people who are involved over here. This is the committee that is deciding, that is contemplating how India, what should be the standing of India on this term of DSI, right? And this is the standing of India. This has been officially submitted to CBD, which is NBA, National Biodiversity Authority, interprets DSI as an integral component of genetic resource. It's a done game. It's written on paper. India has agreed to this fact that DSI is an integral component of genetic resource. The only point is how to regulate its access and benefit sharing. So that discussion, as far as India is concerned, we are taking it for understanding that whatever information can be generated from the biodiversity in India must be treated as a genetic resource. Okay? Physical tissue and DSI, two components of the genetic resource. Definition of DSI, we agree, it needs further clarification. Now, when we try to assess our efforts as a nation, there are 3 points which I find is very relevant if we have to comprehend and if we have to address this point, this issue. First is characterization of the biodiversity. Do we even have a characterized biodiversity? Do we have the data on that? Second is national data repository. If you don't have a data repository of your own, how will you manage the benefit sharing? You can't put it in open access in NCBI. There has to be some mode where every national data has to come, and then you can figure out, okay, now you have to release it and now you don't have to release it. So that will only come when there is a national data repository. And third is, whatever we may say, we have to enhance our capacity to ourselves exploit our biodiversity. Not exploit, use our biodiversity. Now, for the first point, there are just a couple of points. Characterization of the biodiversity. Now, India is not carrying out molecular characterization of its biodiversity. It's a very alarming. And what will happen is this concept of overlapping biodiversity. Do we really imagine that we have everything unique which is not there in our neighboring countries? That's not true. There may be certain changes in those varieties, but more or less, ashwagandha is going to be here also, ashwagandha is going to be there in Bangladesh and other countries also. Now, if we don't characterize our biodiversity, they will be able to, suppose, do it. And if they do it, and someone else uses that, even though we had that variety over here, we will not be able to stake a claim. Right? So, we say that India, any country for that matter, it's not, these boundaries are political, they are not ecological. Right? It's not that if you cross the boundary, ekdam se environment changes. It doesn't happen that way. The vegetative flora and fauna are very, very similar. National Biodata Repository, this is what I am working right now. This is something that I am relaxed that now we are working on it. There is a National Biodata Repository, IBDC, it is being set up at RCB, and Dr. Dinesh is also PI in that. So, mandate is that archive, curate, dissipate, and anyway, trainings and things. But main thing is all life science data is going to come over here. Sorry. In this data portal. DNA sequence, metaboloid, whatever you think of it, that is going to take. This is a portal that is now active. The first services that the data center has started is to take up nucleotide data summation. Okay? Because that makes hallmark base for a lot of other data sets. So we have two repositories. One is INDA. This INDA is actively synced with INSDC repository. So if you submit anything over here, you will automatically get NCBI and EMBL and DDBJ accession numbers. Okay, so that thing is sorted out. You don't need to submit to NCBI, you just submit to IBDC. This is the one which is of restricted access. That is for data that you don't want to access, for data that you think will be exploited, you can submit over here. This is where, this is the one that is going to help implementing the models, whichever model is decided for DSI sharing. This is the status. We already have more than 2 lakh submissions. This is my last slide, and this is something, a thought-provoking slide, where it is an uphill task to actually increase our capacity to use this biodiversity. But that is something that has to be done, and that best happens when at your stage, you are thinking both as a scientist and an entrepreneur. And I'm not saying not to go in depth of science. You have to do that. You have to be different from a person who is coming from an MBA background. So you have to be a very good scientist. But keep this perspective in mind that this needs to be implemented at some point of time. Maybe by you or your colleague or whosoever. It is not going to click for all of you. All of you may not want to do that. That's also fair. But whosoever wants to do that, this is the time when you can think of becoming an entrepreneur. I take a stop here and I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Saurabh. There is a time for a few questions. If you have any, please raise your hands.
So in case where it's not clear whether traditional knowledge is owned by just one particular community and it's like a national level, whether it's Ayurveda or traditional Chinese medicine, so in that case, how will be the access and benefit regimen will take place?
Good question. Actually, nowhere it is known which single person knows a particular thing. It's always a community. That is why these transactions happen at national level. So once there is an authority or whatever mechanism, those funds will come to there. And then those funds, it is something like taxation. I give money to the government to do a lot of things. Making a road, making this research institute, lot of things. But that portion of money will be directed to that population which we think knows that. So ultimately it's not that what me and you know. Ultimately what it means is what as a nation we know. So kahin se that fund will come and it will get assimilated in all of our activities. There are cases where you can actually very directly pinpoint to, let us say, northeast of India, let us say southern part of India. That can be done, right? But to pinpoint to a particular tribe, that is very, very difficult. So it's a distributed thing. It happens indirectly anyhow, right? Nobody is an owner of that thing. At that point of time, the idea of open access and restricted access was not there when Ayurveda was being done, right? So things would have been organized if that commercial angle was there at that point of time. But fortunately, that was not. Otherwise, I don't think this much would have been figured out.
Any more questions? So in case there are none, thank you, Saurabh, for sensitizing us against this very important issue. It's an eye-opener for most of us because we are really indeed not aware about DSA and its repercussions. So thank you so much for coming here. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
And here is a small memento in appreciation of your efforts and scouting through the traffic and reach us.
Actually, that's my daily driving route, but I mean, today it was mind-blowing.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.